Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second TOK panel talk for 2020-21. I'm Mr. Miller. I'm the host today, and we're talking about the second PT. Before we get going, I'm going to introduce our panel. I don't know who it looks like for the other screens, but for my screen, to my immediate, I guess this is my left, but it looks my right, Mr. Johnson from our TOK department.
Hello.
On my other side, I have Tamika D'Souza, one of our grade 12 students. Hi, Tamika.
Hi.
Down below, I have Ms. Kasanuki, one of our science teachers. Hello, Ms. Kasanuki.
Hello.
I also have Jongsuk Rem, known as Remy, right below me. Hello, Remy.
Hello.
And we have our head of school, Vladimir Guskovsky, in the bottom corner. Hello.
Hello.
So our topic today is Prescribed Title II, and the title reads, Within areas of knowledge, how can we differentiate between change and progress? So really at forefront here is this distinction between change and progress. So my first question for the panel is going to be how we conceptualize those two words. And in kind of the theme that Andrew started on our previous one, I'm going to make a Goldsberryan gambit here with how does that definition work for you? Is change and progress two completely different circles, or is there some overlap in that Venn diagram? Is all progress a kind of change, so it's progress within the change? How do you view the relationship with them in their definitions? And maybe I'll start with Mr. Johnson. We'll go from there.
Right. So I think when we often think about progress, there's definitely a pronounced human element. We often think of something being relativized to a goal, an aim, a target we have in mind. Whereas change, I might be tempted to modify change with the word mere, like mere change. Like I want to think about progress and you're only giving me change, mere change. So I would be inclined to think that change is a very general category that describes all sorts of types of transformations from the natural world and including the human world. But often when we're wanting to think about progress, it's a more specific category, relativized to these goals and objectives that us humans have. What do others think?
What's your take on that, Tamika?
Well, for me, when I look at progress and change, I see it as two circles, but one within the other. It's like all progress is change, but not all change is progress, because I feel like it can go in two separate ways. Because I personally think progress is getting to a step better than where you were before and not just moving from the position you are currently.
Okay, does anyone have a counter to that? Does anyone sort of disagree that that there can be a kind of progress without some kind of change?
I
think kind of.
I'll go with Remy first, and then over to Dr. Guskovsky.
I kind of think that like all progress is change, but not all change is progress. So like progress has an element of change from going from one to another or whatever that may be. But in the end, progress is normative and it has some subjective elements to it. And it's kind of like the interpretation of change in some sense.
Okay. And Dr. Guskovsky?
just for being devil's advocate, I think definitely I agree that not all change is progress. That's pretty obvious. But I also think that it depends how we interpret progress and how it occurs. It may not be change. And I mean, in the traditional definition of what change is. So you can have, sometimes progress is changing nothing. So it's because you could be on a perpetual change cycle thinking that change means improvements, and maybe you have a 5-step program to get there. But after 3 steps, you realize that, okay, we've gone so far, but now in order to progress further, we don't need to change anything. We can just stay put for a while and get better at what we do. I mean, there is numerous examples I could think of, but on pure theoretical level, I think just being stagnant could be progressive in certain circumstances. So having no change could contribute to progress.
I know some
Yeah.
teachers who would probably say that if there was no change in a certain year, they would consider that progress for sure.
Yeah.
Mia, please
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, so for science, change is very clear, right? You have a change in temperature, you have a change in speed, or like something like that. Progress becomes, I don't know, in my opinion, becomes when it opens parts of the subject up, right? So a big step in biology progress was the development of PCR, the polymerase chain reaction. It opened up all of genetics because now we understand so much more about DNA, so much more about how this, how all of this is, the world of the biological world. Is it change? It's really not, because like you're just kind of understanding the world better, but it's progressed the understanding of like life. So
Yeah.
change, like there's clear, like in science, there's clear definitions.
So that's the kind of a nice segue to my next kind of question. Can we conceptualize progress differently depending on the area of knowledge, or in more layman's terms, the subject, right? Like, do different subjects define progress differently and maybe even potentially contradictorily? Tamika, I see you nodding. You want to respond to that?
I personally think that progress is a very subjective idea, the idea of progress, because it's due to usually individual goals of people in a certain area. And as I said, it's usually a step ahead of where they are at that point, but it's something that changes from person to person. Like what I think of all the time when I think about how different people see progress in different ways, it's like if we look at things like discrimination, there's one group of people that thinks that's for the betterment of the world, and another group that is like, oh, okay, no, this is not okay. But each one of them sees it as progress for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean progress is always selfish, or like?
No, it just means that it's usually, unless we're looking at something that we assume is something that should be, when it's like a consensus agrees on something. And because when I think of that, I also think about the fact that in society we have unsaid laws on how a society works in order to function properly. Things like abiding by the laws that are set by your individual country or just the world round. And when we look at that, then we can say, okay, that's when we kind of come to a consensus and decide what is progress and what is not. But for individuals, it changes for everyone.
I'm reminded of the old saying, one person's trash is another person's treasure. Is that necessarily true with progress? Like, if is one person's progress always necessarily, or in some ways necessarily, someone else's regress, or potentially?
I don't think so, but I think what I kind of agree with Tamika on the case that, I mean, it's not all the same all the time, but progress could be a subjective thing. I mean, if we take an issue, any issue, and there's however many of us, we can view it as a progress or as a regress or as nothing at all, because that's not an important issue to us. We just don't think about it. So I think it depends. It also depends on, it depends on the issue. But if we're speaking globally, let's say take some huge topic like, climate change first. I mean, people will have some pretty sound articulated ideas what progress is and what progress is not. And even there, you have some voices of dissent that may not agree with the vast majority. But then if you take issues like discrimination, what Tamika mentioned, yeah, obviously, I mean, it certainly was true back in the history when the whole discrimination started. It's even true today, because some people think it's a good thing, some people think it's not a good thing. And obviously, something people think that fight for civil rights and against discrimination is a progressive thing for the society, while the other thing otherwise. So that's, I think it's there isn't a uniform answer to that. So I think it needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis and issue by issue.
Go ahead,
I have
Ms. Kasanuki.
a question. So does that mean like the social, so it sounds like we're talking a little bit about social progress. Does it mean, can we really know that we're progressing? And is it like, I guess my question is, can we know how much we've progressed until we've actually like reflected a number of years afterwards? Like, can we tell that we're actually progressing right now socially? Like, it sounds easy to, kind of easy. I mean,
I think that that's a great question, and we can answer that. But I think in order to answer that, we're going to have to talk about a definition of progress within at least an area of knowledge, because you need to know what you're measuring before you can figure out how you measure it, right? So, Ms. Kasanuki, I'm going to throw it back to you to maybe help you explore that. Is you gave me a definition of change and progress in science before. Can you give us that definition again in science and explain how that might be measured in science based on the definition?
Can you one more time?
You said before that you had clear definitions in science of change and progress, right?
Well, change, progress.
Okay. Well, I think you said something about it opens the subject up.
Yeah.
Right.
So
how could we measure that, for example?
Okay, sure. So like change would be, you can measure it, right? You can physically use something to measure it. So like a thermometer, a meter stick.
Do a representation.
A mass. Right, you can measure change. Progress would be like, I don't know, things like, discovery of the electron. It opened up so much new parts of the world for us to have things like electronics. PCR opened up genetics, and just like understanding the atom and how the periodic table works. Opened up a lot of chemistry. And now, about in the 1900s or so, I can't remember the years because I suck at history. There was a saying that was like, we're almost done understanding the physical world. And then now they don't, right? It's like, we can't even connect gravity and time. So is it really?
So I'm going to go Mr. Jakes. I know he wants to jump in there, but I just want to just quickly add, so Ms. Kasanuki, to clarify, when you say open up, are you kind of defining progress in science, at least one way to define progress in science would be a change that leads to many more changes directly?
I would define it at progress as a new discovery that opens up the ability to ask more questions.
Okay.
And with that you can discover more, to ask more questions about the physical world.
All right. Mr. J, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add to that formula the idea of unification in science, which I always find this to be a driving, for me, out of all the areas of knowledge, science, natural sciences, is a very clear example of a measurable type of progress. I think with this drive for unification, it's a very compelling idea that prompts all scientists from all disciplines across the planet to strive for this kind of unified picture. And a lot of the other AOKs and areas of knowledges that we think about don't necessarily have that as a goal in mind. So I think in the case of natural sciences, we probably do have a metric, and that metric seems to be quite clear. Now, how exactly we measure the unity of science itself is a hairy question, but compared to our other disciplines, it seems to be pretty clear. And ethics and philosophy in TOK is one of those much hairier realms. So I don't know. I think, Remy, when it comes to progress in philosophy or ethics, is there anything measurable about that compared to science?
Well, so I define progress as obviously being normative as such, but I think that, like, if you want to measure progress in any field, and especially in ethics or whatever you want to talk about, it's like the question is, how much are the things that come after it dependent on its existence? So let's say a philosopher came up with this logical theorem or an ethical idea and publishes it, and then everything after that is now has to either acknowledge it or has to, or comes out of that, or is dependent on its existence as like a presupposition, then that would mean that that piece of work was a big piece of progress. Whereas let's say somebody wrote something and it has a small impact on a small journal and it doesn't really, lead to a high dependency on its topic or its conclusions, then that would mean that its footprint has less progress, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Would it have to be within the same area of knowledge?
Well, I mean, I think it's easier to look at it that way. Like, you can say, like, for example, in art, like, pop art is really based on advertising and those capitalist images. So then you can say, okay, capitalism helped progress art or pop art in some way, but like, and that's kind of interdisciplinary. But if it's intentional, if it's meant to be intentional, if the progress is, if what you want out of that thing is intentional and you know where you're going with it, or you believe where you're going with it, then I guess it should be within the same field in some sense.
Well, let me ask this question. I'm thinking of an example here. So Christopher Nolan's movie Interstellar is an piece of art, right? But in making that movie, they actually discovered some things about science.
Really?
So would you, in terms of the black hole, the way they created it in the movie, and it actually led to more understanding about black holes. So would you consider that artistic progress or scientific progress? Like, what defines the progress? The original or where it goes?
Well, where it goes. So, I mean, we can, if it's, because it didn't, like, understanding the black hole more didn't add to the movie, right? Like, I mean, maybe you can argue that. That's arguable, but let's say, like, for a non-scientific viewer, like, for me, it was the emotional connections and all that kind of thing, right? Whereas the result of it was a scientific knowledge, and that's more pertinent to scientists. And if we're going back to, like, we talked about regression and progression and, like, points of view, then in the point of view of the scientist, that's much more important. So I guess it also weighs on what you put importance to is how you view progress. So in that case, if I'm a viewer of the movie as just enjoying it, then no, it doesn't matter. But if I'm a scientist and that's what I care about, then obviously I will see that as a scientific progress and artistic progress.
Yeah, and I'll add in too, now that you bring up that amazing example, Mr. Miller, I think what it adds to science there too is this amazing power of simulation. And so back to your question of, kind of bumping the rug, like if one AOK progresses, does another necessarily regress? You can have these simultaneous progressions, and part of that progression could be the very changing of the boundaries of what the AOKs consider their division of labor. So I think historically in physics, for example, computer simulations didn't seem to be important, especially as a source of empirical research. And now they're hugely important in cosmology. Cosmology is all about computer simulations. So progress in one area of knowledge can change the very boundaries of what our areas of knowledge have. And religion versus science is a good example too. I mean, people say science progresses, therefore religion might regress, but perhaps another perspective will say science is progressing, and now we know better what the purview, what the jurisdiction of religious questions is. And therefore religion is progressing in some sense.
I guess I'm going to throw it just straight back to you, then I'm going to move over, because I know we want to include a lot of voices, but I want to add to that. What about the idea that, like, the battle of ideas and then one wins out, that's progress? Does that mean the other one is now automatically regressed, right? It depends on, like, if you're a string theorist champion and you're, oh crap, that I lost, like, does the winning of one idea that progresses necessitate that something else regresses?
Can I make a point?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if we're that we can use that example, but, like, I think, doesn't everybody, like, eventually want true knowledge and what is good and what is the best, right? Like, that's what we all want.
Yep.
And if one wins, that means that is the best, or that is true as far as we know it at the moment. So wouldn't that be a positive for then everybody? And, like, in a way, like, even if you are wrong, you still win because you're part of that community.
Good. That's getting me to my next question. I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Guskovsky or Tamika to ask about this question. Can we actually, like Remy seems to be suggesting there, that it's potentially possible to have an objective definition of progress, not necessarily a subjective one. So that's my question. Can we ever have this general idea of objective progress, or does it always need like a qualifier, like scientific progress, economic progress? What do you think?
Well, to me, well, I can go first. So I think it's yes and no, because I think we can have a generic definition of progress, and then it could be customized to area of knowledge or subject area. So per se, let's say so progress is moving towards a certain goal. So basically, let's take philosophy that I was like, basically, let's say the philosophy of communism, for example. So you have like socialism as a first stage, and then developed socialism, and then communism, and that's when you arrive, so to speak. Or parallel theory of capitalism and developed capitalism and free market, and how that progresses also. So basically, we can argue like we live in a capitalistic society. So have we arrived because we are at a certain stage now? Or so basically we can say that capitalism, the development of capitalism is a progress because we want to enhance it and make it better and define what better means and all of that. But we still have to define clearly, so what does it mean? When do we, like, you don't know if you get there if you don't know where there is, right? You have to have a goalpost, so to say. So like if you read, I'm just going back to communism because Mr. Johnson is there, so he's a communist. So
True.
So basically saying that the Communist Manifesto defines as communism as an obsolete society. And it may be fictitious or not, but it sets a goalpost of what it looks like. And so then you start moving. So in socialism is a step towards communism. So you're kind of, you know, your goalpost where you're aiming for, and every step that gets you closer there, meaning that you're progressing. So this is the progress. So can we say the same, can we take the same definition and apply it to capitalism? Probably not, because capitalism will have a completely different, goalpost altogether, because that's a different philosophy. And this is even within one discipline, within the philosophy. But if we take something scientific, as Ms. Kazanuki was saying, then the definition of progress is much more specific and not all abstract and sort of vague. Because you say like, well, like going to periodic table. So when periodic table, I mean, this is as much as I know about science, so I might as well just say it. So when periodic table was invented, there were spaces left in it for the elements to be discovered. And that was clearly, okay, so it was initially, I don't know to what degree it was initially filled in, but there were quite a few spaces that then eventually got filled in. So the science progressed by virtue of filling the periodic table. And it's pretty clearly defined and it's tangible. And you can say, okay, we discovered a gas, so it fits in this block. And so we're going to discover some acid that could fit here, or this element or that. So I think it's much more specifically defined. In philosophy, it's different. You can't define philosophical progress with such specificity. I hope I'm making sense.
That's really good. And I want to take that and pass a question to the panel here. So that we just define progress in a sense of moving towards a goal. So I have two questions around that. I'm going to start with the first question. The first question is that maybe potentially challenging our definition earlier that all progress is a kind of change? Does that kind of maybe support the challenge that was made earlier that, you know, if you were to reach that hypothetical goal, would progress then become not changing, like maintaining the goal? Like, would that be considered progress, a lack of regress, for example? Tamika, what do you think about that?
I honestly think that there's never an end goal to anything because we don't know where the end is. So it's not something we can necessarily say that, okay, this is the end goal, it's like the universe. We know where like solar systems end and we know where galaxies end, but we never know what the end of it really is.
I like that because it kind of plays into Ms. Kasanuki's answer before about one definition of progress in science is that it leads to more questions, more exploration. There's a good TED Talk, I can't remember now, where the guy actually says the goal of science is not to lead to discoveries, but it's to expand our sphere of ignorance. So like it shows us how much more we don't know. And Tamika, you're kind of suggesting that possibly that's endless. So there's always progress to be made in that sense. How do people feel about that definition of progress? Is this kind of like endless striving towards learning more questions?
Well,
I agree.
Go ahead. I'm going to go with Remy here.
Yeah.
No, I agree. Like I was gonna make this same point where it's like, if you, I think that first of all, like I don't think progress is to be so linear. So what Mr. Guskovsky was saying about like, here, let's make a manifesto, let's make a plan now, and then let's go do. You know what I mean? Like I don't think it has to be so exacting, like and so predefined. I think that like I like this idea of Aristotle's final causation, where it's like the more you go up, or the more you go, the more road you find to go on. You know what I mean? Or the goals keep changing as you go, and that's a feature of progress in my mind, because if you know more, then you should know more questions, like exactly what Ms. Kazuki was saying. And I think this idea that like there's always this idea of newness with progress, like maintaining something is a stagnation, and it's kind of like cyclical, but I think progress is always from here to there. It's a new location, it's a new place, it's a new idea, and on top of that, it's very the place that is new is always, novelty is always changing, right? Once we get something, it's not novel anymore. So in that sense, I don't think it has to be linear either.
So my next question I'm going to direct over to Ms. Kasanuki, because Ms. Kasanuki, you almost have competing answers here from things you've said earlier that I'd like to get your take on. You mentioned before that like sometimes progress is only really realized on reflection. Like you look back and you go, oh man, look how far we've come. But that kind of seems to run counter to me, this concept of we have a goal we know we're working towards. So I guess I'm asking, like, does progress always need to be kind of predetermined? Like I have this goal, I'm working towards it. Or is it something we can look back on and say, oh wow, look how far we came. We didn't realize it was happening when it happened. And if so, what's the metric there?
Well, like, you know, when people first discovered, let's say, the three parts of the atom, right? It was the neutron, the proton, and the electron. And then they slowly realized that you can break them down into smaller things and smaller things. And there's, you know, muons and gluons and all these other things that are starting to develop. And, you know, I think it's important to really think about, you don't know where you're going to progress to, right? You just keep searching to understand the universe, and maybe you go really big into the galaxy, into space, or you go really small, and at some point you will hit something that it's like something completely different, and it just opens up the natural world some more. You know,
but to get back to the question then, how is that different than change? That's the original PT. How do we differentiate between change and progress there if we don't really know what we're progressing towards?
Well, I guess it's how you define change, right? Because you are changing what you how you are seeing things. But is that, I don't know, I guess it would be kind of the idea of starting to blend change. You're changing the definition of change to kind of fit progress.
I guess my question is, and I'll pick this up to the whole wide panel here, and anyone can respond to this. Do we kind of live in a system where it's all just change, and it's only considered, some of that is considered progress upon reflection? Is that what the situation we find ourselves in?
Well, I might interject there and say that might be the Eastern view, or one of the Eastern views that we don't have on the table yet. So in traditional Chinese Taoism, for example, the classical Taoists might actually, from the very beginning of our conversations today, deny the distinction between change and progress. because after all, for the Taoist, there is the Tao, the way that's constantly flowing, and all us humans need to do is similar to what Dr. K said earlier, not active effort. It's actually a kind of extreme passivity. We need to kind of stop trying to be human and stop artificially progressing and, you know, tap into the flow. So I think we do need to recognize that some ideologies and some cultures are going to struggle with this very distinction. And there might be a pronounced Western flavor to a hard and fast distinction between these categories.
Tamika?
I think personally, just the issue that comes with this, the distinction between progress and change is honestly the way we measure certain things. What I went to a neuroscience camp thing when I was in the 8th grade. My mother sent me there for the summer, and when we were there,
that sounds like a fun summer. Sorry.
Yeah, what my teacher reiterated like a lot of the time was that the reason people label things, people give things units, is for understanding, because as human beings, we need that understanding to feel secure. Mm. So the idea of change for most people is it's not the way it was before, whether it's regressive or progressive. The issue with progression is that we all obviously measure it differently, and it's something that we can't measure. Like, how do you measure how much we've changed something? I feel like it becomes a thing of you can't quantify it. So it's like, oh, it's better, but it's worse. But how much better and how much worse is something that we can't really put a label on, and that's where the issue comes.
So that leads me to, I think we'll try to wrap up here a little bit, but I think it leads me to a final question for the panel, and I'm going to put this out for anyone to respond to, is this question of measurement. And I'd like to get some different definitions or some competing definitions of how we might measure progress in different areas of knowledge. So thinking like, I think we've covered science, but what does progress look like in mathematics? Or what does it look like in ethics? What does it look like in art, history, and how might that be different between those things?
Well, if I jump in here, I think again, because I don't know science and mathematics too much, but from the outside perspective, it seems to me, and Ms. Kazanuki sort of confirmed that when we talk about sciences or mathematics, it's very concrete. So let's say there's an equation that's being solved for centuries, and so once you solved it, that's progress. It's tangible. You can touch it. You can say this is the effort. And then we can reflect on it and see what went in it, and maybe then the next goalpost arrives. When we talk about ethics or languages or philosophy, that's a whole different. So I mean, we talk like ethics. We talk about ethical and moral values. First of all, it's not the same from different, like from east to west, let's say. And I mean, you can, if it's societal, different society we know all of that. So the definition of progress could be very much progress in one society, which means absolute horror regression in the other society, based on the moral code and values that professed by this or that society. So it's very difficult. So we can only, this is what, going back to what Tamika was saying early on, this is where it becomes very subjective, at least to a cultural group, because you're applying your own ethics, which may not necessarily be as an ethic or ethics of another cultural group. And so you measure against your own. And so you develop that definition of progress, and you establish your own measurement, which may not be true somewhere else. And I also think when we measure progress in history, again, I mean, you take something as mundane as war, but so you have a winner and a loser, and the winner writes the history. So it's a progress if you're on the winning side, but if you're on the losing, not so much. and depend which angle you view that historical event from. I mean, so yeah, so that's why I think it seems like when we talk about progress and dividing it by areas of knowledge, in my layman's view, it seems it's very specific and concrete in some areas and sort of a easily, clearly defined, and it's a complete enigma in others areas. So it's not the same. So I don't think it's possible to come up with the singular definition of progress or change, for that matter, that's unique for all the areas of knowledge.
In terms of like in TOK, we talk about the knowledge framework that frames like the different areas of knowledge. And one component of the knowledge framework is methodology within the different areas of knowledge. Is a potential definition of progress that might be widely applicable be something that like a discovery or some sort of change that refines the method of the area rather than like a specific discovery within it?
That, I think that's another approach, because I mean, when we talk about methodology, again, I'm thinking of something that what can we measure in a tangible way, and like can we like if we can't measure the discovery in the same way because it's so very different, can we measure a methodology to which we arrive to those discoveries? To some degree, yeah, I guess we can, because methodology is probably less specific than the discovery in this or that area, and you can use the same methodology across several subjects.
Well,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, what I was thinking there was like my background is largely history, and I don't know how else I would define historical progress than by better methodology, like better research, more perspectives being included, but not necessarily like what the discovery, but how we're getting more accurate discoveries. That's how I would probably define progress in history, for example. But I don't know if that applies to like art, or maybe it does. So that's where I kind of was trying to play with that one.
Yeah,
I mean,
go ahead, Rem.
oh, I'm just like, he just brought up art, and like, I don't think you can say that like because I'm splattering paint on a canvas versus I'm like doing a realistic rendition of, I don't know, like I don't think the methodology in art can actually determine like a progress or regress or whatever that is. I think it's just about personal taste, personal flavor. Like there's people today who enjoy Renaissance art, and then there's people who don't like it and prefer modern art or contemporary art. Like I don't think that methodology has an influence on that.
Go ahead, Tamika.
But couldn't you argue that then a type of progression would be the introduction of new art styles?
So are you talking about, okay, I think that's a great point, because up till now we've been talking about like history and war and all that, and it's like always one side and a losing side and a winning side. But maybe if we look at it like for the entire art community, the more there is, the richer, like the more the merrier, right? It's like there's more to choose from, there's more choice, there's more, yeah, you know what I mean? Like you can combine things, it brings possibilities of new artworks, like to a larger spectrum, I guess. So maybe like if you see it in a way that, okay, let's the entire art community, the history of art, then it will be great. But like, I guess in a personal perspective, there's people who don't like to view that, who like to view that, and there's like debates between them in a sense, right? But I guess the fact that debate exists is even in that way of progress.
Mr. J, do you want to add to that?
No, well, I like the focus on methodology, and I don't know if that's going to be the whole part of progress, but it seems clear to me, like Dr. K brought up mathematics, thankfully, because I need to talk about math at some point. But, you know, if you're a Platonist in mathematics, for example, and you believe that all the truths are there to begin with, math is like a self-contained universe. So this idea of collecting more proofs or theorems might not necessarily add up to progress. But another version of mathematical progress that I like to think about is better and better notation. And notation goes hand in hand with methodology and these things that we're talking about now. And I don't know, perhaps in art, if I think about cinematography, you know, there's certain types of art that I think the tools and the methods and the technologies that we have to open new possibilities for artwork might really play into possible progress. But I like to focus on methodology. I would say that that's got to be a key part of all of our types of progresses.
Well, one last thing I'll add about, I think it may be potentially another key part. My last question for the panel is, does all progress imply or require an element of morality? Like, is it implied that for progress, it's got to be good in some way morally? Like, for example, if we found something happen like economic progress somewhere, but it actually destroyed a rainforest, that was really bad. So therefore it wasn't really progress. Like, does all progress require that it be good or no?
See, Remy, go.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Remy.
Well, you go first.
I do think there needs to be some. It doesn't have to be moral or ethical, but something like normative has to be there. Like, I think it's, for example, like in the case of economics, like you brought up, like there's different metrics of progress. So GDP is one, but then there's also the social cost index or something like that, where it's like they measure all of, like, because GDP doesn't take into account climate change or deforestation of those things, but there's other metrics that do. So I guess those things would measure progress better in some sense, and there needs to be a notion of something good happening in that sense. So yeah, I agree with that.
Dr. Guskovsky?
Yeah, well, I think it's, again, it's splitting hairs, really, because it's not the same everywhere. Because again, I said I would say yes from my perspective, because I think morality is really important. But then we talk about morality, and what does that mean? I think even if we take the traditional Eastern and Western mentality, that's whole different things. For morale, I think, yeah, it's absolutely important, and it's what makes progress. But then somebody would argue that, you know, sacrifice morality for the sake of progress, for the greater good, is it worth it? And somebody would say, absolutely yes, because but I'd say in my book, no. That kind of defeats the progress if it infringes on morality. But and that's why we have, even now, in any research that we do, again, in the Western world, we have a disclaimer that it has to be ethically and morally appropriate. And like when I did my dissertation, I had to do that, and everybody does in any research. I'm not sure if that exists in some other society, because maybe, yeah, I don't know.
But even to your point, though, even the greater good argument is in itself a moral argument, right? It's just a different.
Of course, yes.
Tamika?
I'll kind of play devil's advocate in this situation to say that progress is progress regardless of whether it is morally correct. Just because I feel like just some things have improved our lives. They may not necessarily have been right, but we can't deny that it's done something.
Yeah.
And I would say I totally agree with Tamika. You know, I mean, I feel like I always bring it back to science, but you know,
you are a resident scientist. So.
Exactly. But like, what is good? Like, there were people that it was illegal to dissect human bodies because it was amoral. But then we didn't understand, you know, what was going on with us until we actually went in and, you know, started dissecting people, which, you know, sounds awful, and at that point was morally bad. And now, you know, all the medical students get a cadaver so that they can learn how to improve the quality of life. So it really depends on like when we are and where we are. So
are you suggesting that there's perhaps like some kind of symbiotic relationship between functional progress and moral progress, that they kind of maybe feed each other? Like we get more open to things if things become more useful, for example?
it's the idea. I think it's not a mutually exclusive thing.
Well,
Like just like you can have improvements, but not change the situation, if you get what I mean. In the morality section.
Okay.
Like, oh, it's more moral, but then it doesn't change something that you'd want to progress in.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Sorry to jump in here. Going back to Mr. Miller question is like, well, then we're and just actually listening to Ms. Kazanuki, I think, okay, well, let's define morality, because okay, so dissecting a cadaver, maybe it was immoral back then, but then again, we're using reflection and saying, well, maybe it's not immoral, because I think, well, in my book of moralities that are very specific to me, maybe, and 3 other people or whatever it may be, we may say, yeah, that's fine, because we're dissecting cadavers. It's not a big deal. We're learning. It's going to save lives in the future. So that's not immoral. So, but then again, so I'm defining morality for myself, because that's subjective also. So when we talk, I mean, I think, and we can just go down the rabbit hole, and because we can just, because why it's so interconnected, everything. So progress, morality, yeah, absolutely. But then what's morality? So, and then like what, and then what justifies what? And yeah, I think on the flips, yeah, we'll stop.
Ms. Kazanuki?
Oh, no, sorry. Somebody came in.
Oh, okay. Well, I actually think that's a good place to leave it. We haven't answered any questions, but we've certainly opened a lot of them, and so maybe that's progress in its own right. So I want to thank the panel today, and I really hope that our TOK Year 2 students at our school and around the world that may watch this on YouTube found this useful. So everyone, have a great day, and thank you once again for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank